What would happen if soldiers on both sides refused to fight? It sounds like a fantasy, a naive pacifist dream, because war feels inevitable, like a hurricane or an earthquake. Something we have no control over. But is that really true? History has moments when war just stopped because ordinary people said enough, and if it happened once, why couldn't it happen again? Christmas 1914, the Western Front of World War I. In the trenches, the living lie beside the dead, and the air is thick with fear and despair. And yet, on Christmas Eve, something unimaginable happens. The gunfire suddenly stops. From the German lines, you hear carols. The British quietly answer back. In the end, both sides climb out of their trenches and meet in the middle of no man's land, shaking hands. A British soldier, John Ferguson, wrote, "Just hours ago we were trying to kill each other, and now we're talking and laughing like old friends." One of his comrades recalled that not a single shot was fired that entire day. It all felt like a dream. Looking at those men gathered in the middle of the battlefield, there isn't a trace of hatred. This extraordinary moment, the Christmas truce, really happened. By some estimates, up to 100,000 soldiers across different parts of the front stopped the war on their own for a few days. The generals reportedly panicked. This virus of brotherhood had to be crushed immediately. Command on both sides issued strict orders: no contact with the enemy. Soldiers were threatened with court-martial, even execution. Units that had fraternized with the Germans were moved to different parts of the front, so they'd forget all about it. The war was meant to go on, and it did for another 4 years, taking millions of lives. But that brief moment in the trenches revealed something important. Soldiers on both sides didn't actually want to shoot each other. When the orders went quiet and the propaganda faded, even for a moment it became clear they were the same kind of people. Cold, exhausted, scared. And instead of dying for someone else's interests, they chose to simply shake hands. No peace conference was needed. All it took was for them to stop listening to their commanders. History has more moments like this. A wave of rebellion swept through the French army in 1917. In the spring, after yet another failed attack, thousands of exhausted soldiers refused to charge into German fire with bayonets. They shouted, "Down with the war," and refused to leave the trenches. It wasn't just one revolt, it was hundreds of them, spreading through nearly half of the French army. Over the course of a few months, tens of thousands of soldiers took part in these acts of disobedience. Terrified, the generals responded with a mix of repression and concessions. Hundreds of the most defiant soldiers were sentenced to death. 49 were executed, officially. The rest had their sentences commuted to hard labor. Many more executions were carried out quietly, staged to look like deaths in combat. Their own governments showed them no mercy. And those who say today, "Good, soldiers should follow orders. They should die if that's what they're told," I take it they see themselves on the side of those who die willingly, with that kind of enthusiasm for self-destruction, not the ones giving the orders. Toward the end of that same war, when the German Empire was in a desperate position, its admirals ordered the navy to set sail on one last suicidal mission in the name of honor, and that's when the sailors said, "We're not going." A mutiny breaks out across the ships. More than 1,000 sailors are arrested for refusing to fight, but it's already too late. The revolution is gaining momentum. Thousands of workers and civilians rally behind the sailors. Protests spread across Germany, all calling for one thing: an end to the war. Within a week, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates and flees the country, and the new government declares an armistice. World War I ended to a large extent because ordinary people had had enough. Regular soldiers and civilians rebelled against dying for the ambitions of their generals. A war that was supposed to last until victory ended almost in a single day. November 9, 1918, when crowds filled the streets of Berlin and cities across the country, demanding peace, and the army refused to fire on its own people. These are just a few examples. In the history of war, there have been moments when people simply stopped fighting. Somehow though, I don't remember anyone talking about that in history class. During the Vietnam War, toward the end of the conflict, American soldiers had such low morale that there were hundreds of cases of what was called fragging, attacks on their own officers using grenades, just to avoid being sent to slaughter. Hardly anyone talks about this, because it's dangerous knowledge, especially for those who profit from war. So let's take a moment and look at war from the financial side. Behind every explosion, every tank, every drone, there's someone making money off it. War is a business, and one of the most profitable in the world. When missiles hit Ukraine and bombs explode in Gaza, defense company stocks go up. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the market value of major arms manufacturers in the US and Europe has risen by nearly 60% on average, while regular stock indexes moved up only a few percent in the same time. Germany's Rheinmetall, a major maker of tanks and ammunition, saw its stock double. Italy's Leonardo, one of the biggest defense companies in Europe, jumped by 139%. And just a week after the new war in the Middle East began, following the Hamas attack on Israel in October 2023, defense stocks rose another 9% on average. Investors know exactly what this is. War is a gold mine, and the data backs it up. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the top 100 arms companies made $632 billion in 2023, up 4.2% from the year before. That growth was driven by demand for weapons fueled by ongoing wars. US defense companies took more than half of that, about $317 billion. Russian arms companies boosted their revenue by 40% in a single year. For them, Putin's war is the deal of a lifetime. And Israel's defense industry hit a record, $13.6 billion in revenue after the offensive in Gaza. Every prolonged conflict is a financial harvest for this industry. Their main clients are governments, but also private investors pulling in massive profits. Just look at the stock market. The biggest shareholders in defense companies are investment funds and banks, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, pouring their clients' money into the arms industry. Often, that means all of us, whether we realize it or not. It works like this: the more wars and tension there are, the bigger the government contracts for weapons, and the faster dividends flow to shareholders. War pays off for a small group, and that group has every reason to keep conflicts starting and dragging on as long as possible. Take Iraq, 2003 for example. The US invasion, justified by claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, turned into a geopolitical disaster, but not for everyone. Halliburton, a major military and energy contractor, landed contracts worth around $6 to $7 billion to support US forces and rebuild infrastructure. In the first year of the war, their revenue jumped by 80%. And here's where it gets interesting. Halliburton had been led by Dick Cheney, who later became vice president under George W. Bush. He was one of the strongest voices pushing for the invasion. Even after officially cutting ties with the company, he was still receiving millions in compensation and held shares in it. So while American soldiers were dying in Fallujah, Halliburton was posting record profits. And its former CEO, Cheney, didn't seem too concerned. But of course, just a coincidence. War is also a business for politicians. There's really no doubt about that. Defense companies know how to reward them, and they have plenty to give. Politicians often end up on the boards of these companies after they leave office, or it works the other way around, with people from the industry stepping into government. Take James Mattis. After his time in office, he joined the board of General Dynamics, one of the world's largest defense companies, making Abrams tanks, submarines, and missile systems. His predecessor, General Lloyd Austin, led a consulting firm that worked with Raytheon Technologies, a major arms manufacturer behind systems like the Javelin and Stinger missiles, the same ones later sent to Ukraine in large numbers. Austin, who was still serving as US Secretary of Defense until January this year, was effectively signing off on purchases of that same weaponry. And what does it look like here in Poland? Even if our defense industry isn't as powerful, politicians still like to present themselves as defenders of the nation, ordering new tanks, new aircraft, because it wins votes and often earns them gratitude from contractors. This military political industrial system is alive and well all over the world. Back in 1961, US President Dwight Eisenhower warned about its influence, and since then, it's only grown stronger. This isn't just about weapons manufacturers. War is like oxygen for a whole network of interests. Private military companies like Blackwater in Iraq, construction contractors, banks financing arms deals, even the media. Because the truth is, war sells. One US general, after 33 years in the Marines, called war a racket, where profits are counted in dollars and losses in human lives. He even admitted that for all those years, he'd been a high-level gangster, serving big business. He talked about US interventions in Latin America in the early 20th century, where people weren't dying for freedom or democracy, but for corporate interests. If we know there are people who want wars because they profit from them, then the real question is, how do they make those wars happen? No normal person wakes up thinking, today I'm going to take someone's life. They have to be convinced, and that's where the most powerful weapon of our time comes in: propaganda. Imagine it's 1990. You hear a shocking testimony from a 15-year-old girl named Naira. Through tears, she tells the US Congress what she saw in a hospital in Kuwait after it was taken over by Iraqi forces. Iraqi soldiers stormed in with rifles, pulled babies out of incubators, and left them on the cold floor to die. The story spreads across the world almost instantly. US President George H.W. Bush repeats it in his speeches. He expresses outrage, calling for action against Saddam. Public opinion in the US, which had been skeptical about intervening in the Persian Gulf, suddenly boils over with anger, demanding that the Iraqi barbarians be punished. Soon Operation Desert Storm begins, and the war with Iraq is underway. And then, the truth comes out. There were no babies thrown out of incubators. The story had been completely fabricated. A piece of propaganda. The witness, that teenage girl, Naira, turned out to be the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the US. She had been coached for that emotional testimony by PR specialists hired by the Kuwaiti government. Her testimony was a part of a large-scale propaganda campaign designed to sell the war with Iraq to the American public. That shocking false message did its job. It created anger and a desire for revenge. And when the lie came out after the war, most people barely paid attention to the correction. All they remembered were the negative emotions toward Iraqis. That's the classic formula of war propaganda. Invent or exaggerate a horror, blame it on the enemy, and spread it everywhere. The outrage and fear will do the rest. Fake stories like this have followed wars for as long as media has existed. In 1914, London newspapers were reporting alleged massacres in neutral Belgium. Stories claimed German soldiers were cutting off children's hands, raping nuns, brutally torturing civilians. And while German forces did commit crimes there, propaganda added its own layer of gruesome details. To stir up maximum hatred, in newspapers and posters of the time, the enemy wasn't even shown as human, but as a wild beast. A famous American propaganda poster from World War I showed a German as a savage ape, holding a woman in one hand and a machete in the other, labeled Kultur. Germany took pride in its high level of civilization, science and art, and that word, Kultur, was often used in their own propaganda as proof of moral and cultural superiority. The poster was making an ironic point that this is what German culture really looks like. It was stamped with a clear message: destroy this beast, enlist. The meaning couldn't be clearer. Germans weren't portrayed as people, but as savage animals that had to be wiped out in the name of defending civilization. The mechanism is always the same. In 1939, Adolf Hitler needed a pretext to attack Poland, so he staged a fake incident at a radio station in the Polish city of Gliwice. German agents dressed as Poles supposedly attacked the station and briefly broadcast an anti-German message in Polish. To make the attack look real, they left behind the body of a concentration camp prisoner, dressed in a Polish uniform, a man who had already been killed by the Gestapo. The next day, German media were blasting headlines about Polish bandits and blatant aggression, and Hitler cynically claimed he had been forced to respond with force. Of course, the entire plan to invade Poland had been ready for months. Propaganda just had to create the illusion that Germany was defending itself. Another example, the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where an alleged attack on US destroyers by North Vietnamese forces gave President Johnson the pretext he needed. Years later, it came out that the second alleged attack never happened, and the first one was at best unclear. But that doesn't bring back the lives of 58,000 Americans or the millions of Vietnamese. And going back to Iraq, the Bush administration spent months warning the world, presenting so-called hard evidence that Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons and might soon have nuclear ones. The famous UN speech by the Secretary of State, with satellite images and that small vial, meant to represent anthrax, went down in history as a textbook case of propaganda. "Every statement I make today is backed by solid sources," he said with a straight face, and the media echoed it exactly as expected. But it all turned out to be a lie. The public was convinced that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The war began, hundreds of thousands of people died, and Iraq was left in ruins. Those weapons were never there. Looking back at it now, it's almost unbelievable how easily we keep falling for the same thing over and over again without learning anything from history. And honestly, it feels like no one even has to try that hard to improve these propaganda methods. Because the same pattern keeps working on us every single time. There are countless examples like this. People sit in front of their TVs, get their dose of fear and anger, and suddenly feel ready to fight. And it's not by accident that I'm showing older events here, because the emotions around them have already cooled down. You can look at it more objectively and actually see how the mechanism works. It's worth noticing, every side in a conflict spins the story, manipulates it, tries to frame its war as righteous and necessary. It's not just something the aggressor does. When the war in Ukraine broke out in 2022, the West used propaganda too, just in a more positive tone, to boost morale. That's how the legend of the Ghost of Kyiv was born, supposedly a Ukrainian fighter ace who shot down multiple Russian aircraft in the first days of the war. The media eagerly ran with the story of this unstoppable pilot. The problem is, he never existed. It was completely made up. War is always surrounded by lies. Whether it's about the enemy's atrocities or your own side's heroism, the goal is the same: to fire people up emotionally so they support violence. So it's worth asking, who are these enemies we're told to hate? Usually, despite what we're told, they're just people like us. They have families, plans, dreams, and most of the time, they don't really know why they're supposed to be shooting at us either. When the propaganda fades, those Russians or crowds turn out to be just regular guys who'd rather grab a beer and go home than die for nothing in a trench. In 1917, after putting down the mutiny in his army, French General Philippe Pétain wrote a confidential report. In it, he said the soldiers' rebellion was just as much the fault of the government as it was of the military command. The government, he said, had allowed ideas of peace to reach the soldiers, and instead of keeping them in line with propaganda, it lost control over them, and the generals were obsessed with breaking through the front, no matter how many lives it cost. Pétain also pointed out something obvious. No human being by nature wants to be cannon fodder. Is that cowardice? Or maybe just common sense? There's an interesting statistic from World War II. It turns out a large percentage of American soldiers didn't fire their weapons at the enemy at all. They were on the battlefield, but either didn't fire at all or deliberately missed. Some studies suggested that only about 15% of infantry actually aimed at the enemy with the intent to kill. According to some psychologists, it came from a natural resistance to taking another human life. When those findings came out after the war, it was a shock to the military. So what did they do about it? They changed the training. In the US military and others, they introduced desensitization techniques, shooting at human-shaped targets instead of simple bullseyes, rhythmic combat chants during drills. They trained mechanical kill responses and stripped away the recruits' natural moral resistance. As a result, in Vietnam, the percentage of soldiers who actually fired their weapons went up significantly, and today it's likely even higher. The system trains us to stop thinking, but it also shows that deep down, people don't actually want this. And that's the key point, worth repeating. A regular soldier on one side usually feels no personal hatred toward the one on the other. That hatred gets put in his head later, through training, ideology, and propaganda. Real hatred often only shows up in the heat of battle, but at the start, people still have to be pushed to go out and kill. And for years, slogans like God, honor, country have been used to do exactly that. Patriotism and defending values, those are powerful ideas, but in the hands of cynical decision makers, they become fuel for war. On one side, people are taught to kill for their country. On the other, for Allah, a leader, or some other sacred cause. The mechanism is basically the same. Let's look at it calmly. Religious fanaticism, pushing suicide attackers to blow themselves up in a crowd, repulses us. We call it brainwashing, ignorance, and we're right. Because that's exactly what it is. But when a young man is told, swear an oath to God and your country, go fight, and if you die, you'll be a hero. So what's the real difference? Just different words? Take Polish history for example. 1920, the Polish-Soviet War. In Polish churches, bells were ringing. Preachers were thundering about a holy war, defending faith and country against godless hordes from the east, and many young men went to die with a cross on their chest, convinced they were fighting in the name of God. The Bolsheviks, of course, knew how to play on emotions too. Even though they were officially atheist, they called on peasants to rise up and strike down the Polish elites in the name of justice for the people. The Warsaw Uprising, 1944. From a military standpoint, a suicide mission. And yet, belief in sacrifice for the nation pushed thousands of young people into the fight. Is that wrong? This isn't a judgment, it's a statement. Powerful ideologies can override the instinct to survive. Our insurgents, our soldiers, fighting for freedom are heroes because they fought for our cause. But for those on the other side, they were the fanatics, the terrorists, just like we see fanatics in someone else's holy war. Every society has trigger phrases that tap into pride and identity. They may sound different, Allahu Akbar on one side, for the homeland on the other, but the effect is the same. The individual stops thinking. I once made a video called "Why do good people become monsters?" and it's worth revisiting, because the mechanisms that push people toward violence are well understood. And you don't even need a war to trigger them. In simple terms, ordinary people can do terrible things when someone who looks like an authority tells them it's necessary. Not because they are evil, it's enough that the system allows it, that they hear you're acting for the right cause. In practice, it works like this. You give people weapons, you tell them those others are enemies of the nation. Then you add a sense of mission while taking away any personal responsibility for what happens. And on top of that comes dehumanization, because they're not really people anymore. They are traitors, beasts, terrorists, and that's it. Solomon Asch, an American psychologist, showed back in the 1950s that most people can agree with something that's obviously false. Like saying a black line is white. If everyone around them insists it's true, even intelligent people will go along with it and call white black under group pressure. That's how he described the results of his study. In war, these psychological building blocks are used almost by the book. There's an order from above, an authority that takes away the need to think or feel responsible, because a soldier can always say, "I was just following orders." There's strong group bonding and pressure not to look weak, not to let your comrades down. On top of that comes the dehumanization we talked about earlier. The enemy is stripped of human traits, and then a higher ideology is layered on top. We're fighting to defend, insert civilization, God, freedom, national pride, whatever fits. So what we're doing must be right. The Nazis even had it engraved on their belts. God is with us. And both sides always believe that God and morality are on their side. That calms the conscience and makes it easier to pull the trigger. Another striking thing is how in war, moral boundaries can flip completely, almost overnight. In normal life, we say don't kill. In war, killing becomes a virtue, as long as you're shooting the right people. A bold attack that leaves hundreds dead gets rewarded with medals. A sniper is praised for a record number of hits, meaning people. Bombs dropped on cities are cynically labeled as stabilization missions. But the truth is simple. War is organized, mass killing, with the blessing of the state. Whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, power gives soldiers a license to kill. It absolves them in advance of whatever happens, as long as it serves its goals. And more than that, it shifts the moral responsibility onto them. Because when something inconvenient happens, a village massacre, torture of prisoners, a hospital being shelled, those in power will say it wasn't an order, it was an abuse. The ordinary soldier becomes the scapegoat. The politicians who start these wars don't even have to get their hands dirty, they have trained citizens to do it for them. One killing makes you a criminal. A million makes you a hero. The French writer Anatole France once said, half ironically, that in France, killing a fellow human gets you prison, or the gallows, unless you do it on a massive scale, in uniform, and under government orders. Then you're rewarded with glory. The whole war system is built to make people stop seeing killing as something wrong. The Nazis called their genocide the final solution, a special action. In Vietnam, Americans talked about neutralizing targets, when those targets were entire villages burned with napalm. Every army has its own language to strip away humanity. It's a shield, meant to protect the soldier's mind from moral shock and make them more effective killers. But sometimes that shield breaks, the weight of conscience comes back, and many veterans end up carrying deep moral trauma. Not just because of what they saw, but because of what they did. In the calm of post-war life, it starts to sink in. They were part of something terrifying. But while the war is still going, no one asks a young soldier what he thinks. He's simply told to do it and made to believe he wants to and has to. He has to because country, honor, orders. But does he really? This is the core of it. Does a soldier, or anyone told to fight, really have no choice? They're told they don't. That desertion means a court-martial, cowardice, disgrace. But look back at those moments from the beginning, the Christmas truces, the mutinies in the trenches, the anti-war strikes. It was possible to say no, to put the rifle down and never pull the trigger again. Yes, the system reacts brutally, with punishment, prison, even death for desertion. But when there are enough of them at the same time, the system becomes completely powerless. Many wars could have ended much sooner if not for the decisions of a handful of people at the top, and the passivity of the masses who allowed themselves to be manipulated. So what would happen if everyone, literally every soldier, said, "I'm not going to fight"? If the people who start wars had to fight them themselves, generals, politicians, dictators, there's a famous anti-war line: imagine a war and imagine no one shows up. A war doesn't happen if there's no one left to pull the trigger. It's a simple truth, and a radical one. When there are no obedient puppets, even a tyrant becomes powerless. For centuries, ordinary people have been told they have no say, but that's a carefully maintained illusion. Wars only happen because the masses follow the orders of elites, because people believe the myth that they have to. Refusing war takes real courage, because suddenly you're standing against your own government, and sometimes even your own people. But how many people have died simply because they didn't have the courage to refuse? How many millions marched straight to slaughter just because they were told to? An army is made of people, and people can choose. Power only rules as long as there are armed individuals willing to follow its orders. It sounds like a utopia, because realistically, you can't expect everyone to become pacifists overnight. Propaganda, fear, and planted hatred are incredibly powerful forces. But the mechanism is real, and those moments from history prove it. All it takes is a large enough group of ordinary people to say no, but that would require something bigger, a kind of mass awakening, awareness on both sides. Did Ukrainian soldiers hate Russians before this conflict started? No. Many of them had family on the other side. Did Russians want to go die for the Kremlin's ambitions? For the most part, no. They went because they were told to, because propaganda convinced them they had to fight. You and I live comfortably today, and war feels distant, almost theoretical. But if we were called to fight tomorrow, the system wouldn't want us thinking critically or asking questions. To me, the idea of a world where people would say, en masse, "Fight your own wars, gentlemen, we don't want them," is worth thinking about. You can laugh it off, reject it, or ask yourself an even harder question. Whose interests are people really killing and dying for when they choose to fight? The Vatican is a sacred place for millions of people, but behind its walls are scandals, fraud, even murder. And it all starts with money. Click the thumbnail on your screen and watch the full story of how the Vatican really built its financial empire. This is called Lemon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.